In the summer of 1952, the objects came back to Washington a second time, and the man whose job it was to explain them away could not do it. The evidence against him was his own. This is what actually happened over the American Capitol on 2 July weekends, in front of radar operators, airline pilots, and fighter crews. And it is the story of an explanation that fell apart the moment its own investigator looked at it closely. It began just before midnight. At 11:40 on the night of Saturday, July 19, 1952, an air traffic controller named Edward Nugent sat at his scope inside the radar room at Washington National Airport. 7 objects appeared on his screen, about 15 miles south-southwest of the city. There were no known aircraft in that part of the sky. The objects were following none of the established flight paths. Nugent called over the senior controller on duty, a man named Harry Barnes. Barnes watched the same 7 returns move across the glass. Years later, he described that first moment plainly. "We knew immediately," he said, "that a very strange situation existed. Their movements were completely radical compared to those of ordinary aircraft. What made the night impossible to dismiss was not one screen, it was many. The objects were not appearing on a single faulty radar set. They were being tracked at the same time on 2 separate radars at National Airport, and independently, several miles away, on the radar at Andrews Air Force Base. When one controller picked up the phone to compare notes with another installation, the men on both ends were watching the same unexplained targets in the same part of the sky at the same time. There was more. At one point that first night, all 3 radar sites, the 2 at National Airport and the 1 at Andrews, locked onto a single object as it hovered over a radio beacon. And then, at the same instant, on all 3 screens at 3 separate locations, the object disappeared. Radar in one place can be fooled. 3 radars at 2 sites, showing the same object in the same spot and losing it in the same moment, is much harder to wave away. And on the ground, at least one man saw something to match. A staff sergeant at Andrews named Charles Davenport watched an orange-red light to the south. "It would seem to hold still," he said, "then make a sudden change in direction and altitude, and then do it again several times over. That is the detail that makes this case so hard to close, though it's only fair to add the other half of it. Other tower operators at Andrews, scanning that same sky with binoculars on that same night, reported seeing nothing unusual at all. The evidence of the eye was mixed. The evidence of the radar was not. Around 3 in the morning, the Air Force acted. 2 F-94 Starfire jet fighters were ordered up from Newcastle Air Force Base in Delaware and vectored toward Washington. And here the night did something that would repeat exactly 1 week later. As the jets approached the Capitol, the objects vanished from the scopes. The screens went clean. The interceptors searched the empty sky, found nothing, and eventually turned for home, low on fuel. And as the jets left, the objects came back. Harry Barnes drew his own conclusion, and it is worth keeping it as his conclusion, and not as fact. The objects, he believed, were monitoring the radio traffic and behaving accordingly, hiding when the fighters were near, returning when they were gone. That is what the man at the scope thought he was seeing. Whether he was right, no one has ever proven. By Sunday morning, the country knew. The story of that first night ran across the front pages of American newspapers. Saucers swarm over Capitol. It's hard now to feel the full weight of those words in 1952. This was the height of the Cold War. The nation lived under the real, daily fear of Soviet aircraft appearing over American cities. And here was the United States Air Force, admitting it had put fighter jets into the air over the Capitol, over the White House, over the Capitol Dome, to chase objects it couldn't identify, and had come back with nothing. For a week, the pressure built, and then the second weekend arrived. On Saturday, July 26th, at 8:15 in the evening, the crew of a national airlines flight coming into Washington saw a set of lights above their aircraft. Lights that did not belong to any plane they could account for. By 9:30, the radar room was busier than it had been the week before. Controllers were now picking up unknown objects in every sector of the sky around the city. At times the objects drifted slowly. At other times they reversed direction and shot across the radar screen at speeds that were calculated from the scope at up to 7,000 miles an hour. No aircraft on Earth in 1952 could do that. Once again, 2 F-94 Starfires were scrambled. This time, one of the pilots got close. Lieutenant William Patterson saw 4 white glowing objects ahead of him and tried to close the distance. What happened next was recorded by Albert Chopp, the civilian press spokesman for the Air Force's own UFO investigation, Project Blue Book, who was standing in the National Airport radar room, listening. As Patterson moved toward the objects, they reversed. They came at him, all 4 of them, and closed around his aircraft in a matter of seconds. Patterson's voice came over the radio. "I see them now, and they're all around me," he said. "What should I do?" And according to Chopp, no one answered. The room was silent, because no one in it knew what to tell him. There is one more detail from that second night, and it says a great deal. Captain Edward Ruppelt was the head of Project Blue Book, the officer whose entire job was to investigate exactly this. He did not find out that the objects had returned to Washington from the Air Force chain of command. He found out when a newspaper reporter telephoned him at his home in Dayton, Ohio, late that night, to ask what the Air Force intended to do about it. The press knew before the investigator did. 3 days later, on July 29, 1952, the Air Force did something it had not done since the Second World War. It called the largest press conference it had held since the end of the war and put the Director of Air Force Intelligence, Major General John Samford, in front of the cameras. Samford's task was to calm the country, and he was careful. He said that the vast majority of sightings could be explained. But he also said something that the Air Force has never quite lived down. Out of all the reports the Air Force had gathered, he admitted, a portion, on the order of 20%, had come from what he called credible observers of relatively incredible things. Credible observers. Of relatively incredible things, he said none of it posed a threat to national security. He didn't say what it was, and then the Air Force offered its explanation for the Washington radar returns. The cause, it said, was a temperature inversion. A layer of warm, moist air sitting over cooler air which can bend radar waves and produce false echoes on a screen. Project Blue Book would eventually file the Washington objects under a single phrase, mirage effects, caused by a double inversion. The weather. It was the weather. It was a clean, calming, scientific answer, and it began to come apart almost immediately, not at the hands of believers, but at the hands of the people best qualified to judge it. The radar experts went first. A temperature inversion, they pointed out, was not nearly strong enough to produce the good, solid, hard returns that had been sitting on those scopes. And the controllers who had actually watched the objects said something simpler still. Weather doesn't maneuver. A temperature inversion, they said, would smear across a radar screen as a vague streak. It would not appear as a sharp point of light that stops, reverses, and darts across the glass at thousands of miles an hour. But the most damaging objection came from inside the government's own investigation. It came from Captain Ruppelt himself. Ruppelt went and looked at the weather records for that summer, and he found this. Hardly a night passed in June, July, and August of 1952 in Washington without a temperature inversion. They were ordinary. They were nearly constant, and yet the solid, slow-moving radar targets had appeared on only a handful of those nights. If inversions were happening almost every night, but the objects appeared on almost none of them, then the inversion could not be what was producing them. The government's own explanation did not survive its own investigators' arithmetic. Years later, the case against the weather only hardened. When scientists went back and actually ran the numbers on the mirage theory that skeptics had proposed, they found that to bend radar and light the way the theory required, the inversions would have needed temperatures of several thousand degrees Kelvin. The real inversions over Washington that summer were warmer than the air around them by only a few degrees. The explanation, examined closely, asked for conditions that had never existed, and so the Washington incident sits where it has sat for more than 70 years. Not proof of anything from elsewhere. No one has ever shown that, but not explained either. Multiple radars, at separate sites, tracked solid objects over the capital of the United States on 2 weekends, in front of trained controllers and fighter pilots. The government offered the weather. Its own chief investigator worked out that the weather could not have done it. And then everyone went home. The men who sat at those scopes that summer never got a better answer than the one they saw with their own eyes. They watched something cross the screen that should not have been there. They watched it turn on a pilot who asked over an open radio what he should do, and then they waited in a quiet room for someone to tell them what they had just seen. No one ever did.